Oh, there you go.
Hello, I'm Leo Flood from the Illinois Student Assistant Commission. I'm a core member in the Wabansie Community College District.
Hi, my name is Anya Shrog, and I'm also a core member. I'm in the Heartland Community College District.
So today we're going to be talking about being a queer student on a college campus and what that entitles for finding community and our personal experience with being queer on campus. You want to start?
Sure, yeah, I can get us started. I think, yeah, just when I was thinking about, this topic and coming into doing this stream right now, I think that definitely college was a really important time for me to, think more about my identity more deeply in many aspects, but specifically related to, my sexuality and my gender identity and expression, things like that. And I think that college is a really great time to sort of think about those things and explore them in a new way, just because you're definitely you're in a more independent situation. You might be, in a different part of the state or a different part of the country than you've ever lived before, anything like that. You're kind of, a little bit more independent from your parents in a way that you haven't been before. So I feel like that was a definitely a pivotal experience in that sense. And then from that, it definitely, when I started to, sort of think about those things more as a college student, I was able to, you know, kind of seek out some like safe spaces or community spaces. I know my university had like a pride group or an RSO, student organization, and I think that's really common on campuses. I also definitely had some professors. Like I was a theater major, so I took a lot of classes in theater and English and things like that. And there are a lot of professors who um, were like great representation, that were, they are able to sort of like freely talk about their sexuality, or, bring up those topics in like a comfortable way, in a way that I was able to, I and other people were able to learn from, and sort of, gain some more perspective and kind of figure out, the way that we identify, or, explore more of that. What about you? How was your experience with that?
So for me, a part of my college going process too was looking for a bigger school. I went to University of Illinois, so there's quite a lot of people there. But I didn't have a lot of queer people around me in high school. And so I thought, well, if there's more people, there's higher chance that I'll find people like me. And I agree. I think that just being away from home and being able to think about myself as an individual and make my own choices was a big part of liberating myself to identify how I wanted to. I remember my first year on campus, I joined an RSO called Women of Pride, and we would get together, talk about queer issues, but also we would just watch movies, talk to each other. It was a great way to get in touch with other people and, not only talk about what we were struggling with, but also our experiences of joy and connection. So what are some other sources of or your experience with community on campus?
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, I was involved in theater a lot. So theater is, historically, in most cases, a pretty welcoming and safe space for most marginalized people, to an extent, people of color and people in the queer community, especially. So that was really helpful to have that support from my classmates and my peers. And I definitely also connected a lot with some professors who also identified as queer, and then sort of, helped me with some like research and creative work that I did with that. One example, I had one professor who invited me to go to a queer literature festival over the summer, and that was really cool. So I got the opportunity to go with her to that. It was at her alma mater, and hear, other people's queer like stories of their queer experience, and either relate to that and be like, oh my gosh, that's so great to hear, or get some new perspectives on the queer community and other experiences that I hadn't or that didn't apply to me. And then I was like, oh wow, that's really, widening my perspective. So that was, I think, honestly, for me, definitely my professors who identify as queer or were supportive were definitely a great place for me, or a great help for me when I was, going, either doing work that kind of had to do with my queer identity, or just me going through life, kind of figuring it out as a college student too, and as a queer person.
Yeah, I kind of, you were talking about like theater earlier and kind of like your connection to art and queerness. And I think for me, that was kind of similar. I was more of in like the writing space and the visual arts. And so for me, especially on campus, there were a lot of great resources and spaces for queer people. But especially in the arts community, I felt like there was some sort of lack sometimes of like specifically spaces like for queer people. So I, along with other people from my community, we started doing queer poetry events, centering queer voices, and that's a big part too. You know, if you're on a big campus, small campus, or just anywhere really, sometimes you do have to make that space for yourself, but that can be an opportunity for other people to also, you know, participate and connect in ways that they wouldn't have been able to unless you were the one to kind of launch that. So I think art and other types of, you know, hobbies, activities, that's a great locus for people to connect on their queerness, feel less alone. So did you in college, like, was there, you know, we're talking like a lot about joy and connection, which is great.
Right, yes.
But, you know, what do you feel like your biggest struggle as a queer student on campus was?
I think, well, I went to a smaller school, since you mentioned you went to U of I, which has a pretty big campus. I went to Illinois Wesleyan University, and it's definitely a lot smaller. So I think sometimes there was definitely the feeling of, I mean, it's hard at a small campus in some ways because everyone does know each other, which is really great. But then there's also sort of a lack of, you know, anonymity in the some sense, or like you might feel like you stand out more. It's like harder to blend in, you know, in a smaller group, things like that. And not that you know, feel like you should feel like you have to blend in, but it's kind of natural to an extent. So I think there definitely sometimes where it's like, oh, I kind of feel like the odd one out, or just sort of isolated, and like having smaller groups also means there's maybe not as variety sometimes in some ways. There also which I think I kind of lost my train of thought there. But yeah, I think that kind of covers what I was going to say. Did you kind of want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I think that I was, you know, I was glad that I had kind of this explosion of like, there's a bunch of queer people, there's a lot of resources, but then I'm also still, you know, there's still a lot of isolation that I felt. I think especially in context of being like a non-binary trans person, although I was in connection with a lot of queer people, it wasn't always, like you said, there wasn't, you know, niche, or there wasn't always a community of specifically trans people to relate to. So specifically, like when I changed my name, I heavily relied on the people around me, but it still felt like I don't know what to do with this feeling, and that's normal. I think that that's just like an experience of, yeah, being like any type of minority, is feeling like, where can I, you know, go to shake this like isolation. But I think overall that really taught me like the value of queer friendship specifically, where I was lacking maybe like support from home, from family, from maybe you know, classmates. I found that friendship really aided that and kind of healed some of that. Especially with just kind of gaining the self-confidence to like reintroduce myself. And I think a lot of queerness is having to, you know, self-advocate and really make sure that, you know, people are referring to you the right way, or just having to establish a self that, you know, other people don't have to do on a daily basis. So I think being able to have those connections, even if it's a few, you know, it was hard to deal with those feelings at first, but that can really like remedy it. But yeah, how do you feel like, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm trying to think. I think I like had something in there while you were talking, but
Yeah.
I got carried away with listening. So I was like, I don't know what to say next.
Do you feel like, how were you able to kind of like, if you had any like feelings of isolation, like how were you able to remedy that? Or yeah, I don't know, maybe even just like some other feelings that you had.
Yeah, I think like you were saying, having those friendships is super helpful for that. So even if it's not like a formal group or space or whatever, having that support just from your friends and having someone to talk to who can relate is definitely super important. I think that's also something that people in queer people in general struggle with, you know, whether you're a college student or not. And honestly, I think in college, it's maybe a good place to be when that happens because there are, you know, so many people your age around you and you are able to access all these other groups and, you know, resources that through your school or through campus or the local community. And I think, you know, after college, it can definitely be a little bit more difficult because you don't have the same amount of like, you know, you're not surrounded by, that's kind of the only time that you're surrounded by so many people that are the same age and, you know, have similar interests to you to this, to that extent.
Yeah, I think that that's why it's so important to kind of take advantage of that time. And I similarly, after college, it was, you know, a big adjustment to go from having a lot of people around me that were explicitly queer, explicitly, you know, very inclusive from different backgrounds, were able to make space for other people into, you know, a different type of community. But like you were saying, like the local community too, like besides having institutional, like, orgs and stuff and having friends in my local community, that was a big part for me, getting in touch with even just queer people in the surrounding area. Like, for example, like my favorite thing to think about in college that was like queer related is there used to be these like queer dance parties in like the local bar, or it was we had like roller skating nights, and some of them were all ages, some of them were of course you know, limited, but just being able to like, even if we're not, you know, chatting or having like these crazy like conversations, being able to take up space together, have joy, but also outside of the student identity, because I think although it's really important to connect with your, you know, student peers, there are still, you know, people in the community who are not in school and are seeking that too. So I think getting in touch with the people who and organizations and, you know, like local libraries, local community, that's a really important part for me too, and I think is also for a lot of other people.
Yeah, nice. I think we just have a couple minutes left. So I guess, do you have any like advice you would give to a, you know, a high school graduate who's incoming to college, or, you know, any current queer college students?
Yeah, I would say that you know, you get to kind of have a blank slate in college in some way, and so when you're thinking about colleges, definitely do some research about what types of resources, not only like, you know, social activities, but like what maybe medical care they have on campus, or what resources. Like for me, a big thing too, at U of I, they have a lavender graduation. So they specifically recognize queer students for their graduation. So you might not be able to find that information like on Google, but social media is a great resource. Sometimes if you look up the name of the school or the acronym, and, you know, search blankly like queer, you can find events or talk to people that you know that went to those schools, or yeah, just I think that's a big thing with deciding. And then when you're there, you know, that's when you can branch out. And I think it's genuinely, for me, was one of the best times of my life, specifically for feeling comfortable in my identity, for feeling comfortable with making connections, making community, and being proud of that. So what would you say to a student?
Well, I think, we kind of talked about this when we were talking to prepare for this, but I think I would recommend, I guess, like I mentioned earlier, taking advantage of the space that you're in, because being in school is really, or being in college is really a unique experience that you don't really have that sort of, you're not surrounded, you're not in that environment usually after that. I would say take advantage, academically of exploring your identity in that way. That I think is something that can be really interesting for people. If your school has like women and gender studies classes, I know my college in the English department, we had some like classes that talked about queer literature and poetry, things like that. So, if you're interested in, exploring the, history of queerness, or like the academic part of it, like the work, the literature, things like that, I would definitely recommend that. Also, if even if you're not a humanities major, you can maybe make that count for some gen ed. So that's kind of a two birds with one stone thing, But
Definitely.
I think exploring sort of like the theory of it, like the written theory and other people's art and literature, can also be a great way to, come into your own identity and kind of validate yourself in that way as well.
Or feel like connected to some type of history or
Yes,
lineage that
definitely.
you might not have known otherwise. So,
Yes, yeah.
But thanks for listening, everyone. We wish you good luck and joy, and yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.